path. The rain pounded the canopy of the woods like a relentless drumbeat as Ellen trudged through the mud, her flashlight flickering with every step. She had ventured into these woods countless times before, but tonight was different. The dense forest seemed to close in around her, swallowing the moonlight and casting eerie shadows that danced just beyond her line of sight. Ellen had grown up in this small town, her father having been the town's forest ranger. She had always felt a strange pull to these woods, a pull that was now both familiar and terrifying. Her father had vanished here 5 years ago, leaving behind only a note that read, "The forest has its own rules." She had decided to search for him on this night, the anniversary of his disappearance. With every step, she felt the weight of his absence, the gnawing fear that she might meet the same fate. The forest was unnaturally quiet except for the sound of her own breathing and the relentless rain. The wind had stopped, leaving the forest eerily still. Ellen knew this quiet was deceptive. The woods had a way of hiding its secrets, wrapping them in layers of silence. After what felt like hours, Ellen arrived at a fork in the path. Her father's note had mentioned an old, abandoned cabin that might hold clues. According to his sketches, this was the right place. She took a deep breath and chose the right path, the one less traveled and overgrown. The path wound deeper into the woods, the trees pressing closer together. As she walked, she felt as if she were being watched. Her flashlight flickered erratically, the beam casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. She paused frequently, trying to shake the feeling of eyes on her back. Finally, she saw it. The cabin. It was half collapsed, overtaken by vines and the relentless encroachment of the forest. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly in the wind. Ellen pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of mildew and rot. The moonlight filtering through the broken windows cast ghostly patterns on the floor. Ellen carefully stepped over the debris, her eyes scanning for anything that might offer a clue. In the corner, she found a weathered journal, its cover barely intact. Her heart raced as she opened it, hoping it might be her father's. The entries were filled with cryptic notes and drawings of the forest, but one entry stood out. "The forest is alive. It watches. I have seen its face. It hides among the trees, waiting for the unwary. I must leave, but the path is no longer clear. It knows I am close to discovering its secrets." Ellen's pulse quickened. Was this written by her father? Had he discovered something terrible? A loud crash from outside startled her. Ellen rushed to the window, her flashlight illuminating nothing but darkness. The rain had intensified, and the wind howled through the trees. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't abandon the search. She turned back to the cabin, and that's when she saw it. A shadowy figure moving outside, its form indistinct but unmistakably humanoid. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her flashlight and bolted for the door, but it was stuck. Panic set in. Ellen pried at the door, her fingers numb and trembling. She finally managed to force it open and stumbled out into the rain. The figure was gone, but she could still feel its presence, like a cold hand gripping her spine. She ran along the path, the flashlight beam darting erratically. Her mind raced as she tried to remember the way back. The forest seemed to shift around her, the familiar landmarks disappearing into the haze of rain and darkness. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate. Ellen's heart pounded as she pushed herself harder, the sound of the footsteps growing louder. She dared a glance back, and her breath caught in her throat. The figure was closer now, emerging from the shadows. It was tall, with an unsettlingly elongated face. Ellen sprinted through the forest, her flashlight sputtering and dying. She could barely see, her only guide the distant, faint light of the town's edge. Just as she reached what she hoped was the final stretch, the figure lunged at her from the darkness. Ellen fell to the ground, scrambling to get up. She finally burst into the clearing near the edge of the woods. She turned around, her chest heaving with exhaustion, but the figure was gone. She had escaped. Breathless, she looked back toward the forest. The rain had stopped, and the moonlight cast an eerie glow over the trees. Ellen knew she couldn't stay. She turned to leave, but then she saw it. A piece of paper pinned to a tree. It was her father's handwriting. "I told you not to come back. The forest doesn't let go. It will take what it needs." Ellen's blood ran cold. She realized with a shudder that she had not escaped. The forest had been toying with her, leading her right to where it wanted her to be. She turned and ran back toward the town, the figure now seemingly a part of the darkness itself. The next day, Ellen's friends and family found her flashlight and the journal in the woods, but there was no sign of her. The forest had claimed her, just as it had her father. The only thing left behind were the haunting entries in the journal, detailing the same fear and confusion that now marked Ellen's last moments. As for Ellen, her story became another whispered legend in the small town, a tale of how the woods had its own rules, and those who dared to defy them were forever lost in its eternal darkness. The echoing silence. Lena had always enjoyed the solitude of her family's remote cabin, nestled deep in the woods of northern Maine. The isolation was part of the forgotten path. In the sleepy town of Havenwood, nestled at the edge of the sprawling Northwood Forest, stories of the supernatural were as common as the morning fog. Despite the local legends, Jake had always viewed the forest as nothing more than a picturesque backdrop for his weekend hikes. But when he received a mysterious letter from his estranged grandfather, everything changed. The letter was brief and cryptic. Jake, the truth lies beyond the forgotten path. Seek the old cabin. Beware the silence. Grandfather. Jake's grandfather had disappeared decades ago, and the letter was postmarked from the small town Jake now found himself in. Intrigued and seeking closure, he decided to explore the forest, hoping to find some answers. The morning was crisp and clear as Jake set out on his hike. The Northwood Forest was renowned for its beauty, with towering pines and a babbling brook. Yet as he ventured deeper, the scenery grew darker, the trees denser. The further he went, the more he felt a creeping unease, as if he were being watched. He found the start of the forgotten path after hours of hiking. It was obscured by thick undergrowth and nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The path was narrow and overgrown, but Jake pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. The forest seemed to change as he walked. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining to form a near impenetrable canopy. The familiar sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, gradually faded, replaced by an unnerving silence. The absence of sound was disconcerting, and Jake felt an oppressive weight in the air. After what felt like an eternity, Jake reached a small, dilapidated cabin. It matched the description from his grandfather's letter, weathered with broken windows and a sagging roof. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior. Inside, the cabin was filled with old furniture covered in sheets, a fireplace with cold ashes, and a musty smell that hinted at years of neglect. On a table in the center of the room lay an old journal. Jake's heart raced as he opened it, hoping it would provide some clues. The journal was filled with detailed notes and sketches. Most of the entries were about the forest, but one stood out. The silence is a lie. It conceals the truth. Follow the sound to the end, and you will understand. Beware the keeper. Jake's curiosity was piqued. He scanned the room, looking for any hint about the keeper mentioned in the journal. He noticed a small door in the corner, partially hidden by debris. He opened it to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Using his flashlight, Jake made his way down the stairs. The air grew colder and the silence more profound. The staircase led to a small underground chamber. On the walls were more symbols, similar to those Jake had seen in the cabin, and in the center of the room was a wooden chest. With trembling hands, Jake opened the chest. Inside, he found old photographs, documents, and a small ornate box. The photographs were of his grandfather, often with a strange figure beside him. The documents spoke of ancient rituals and a guardian of the forest. The box, when opened, contained an old pendant with a symbol that matched those in the cabin. As Jake examined the pendant, he felt a sudden change in the atmosphere. The air grew heavier and the temperature dropped. He turned to see a figure standing in the entrance to the chamber. It was tall, with an ethereal glow, and its face was obscured by shadows. The figure wore a cloak adorned with symbols similar to those in the journal. The figure spoke in a low, resonant voice. "You should not have come here. The forest does not forget." Jake's heart pounded as he tried to back away, but the figure advanced. The silence was now filled with a deep, resonant hum, and Jake realized the truth. The silence was not a void, but a barrier concealing the forest's guardian. He turned and fled up the stairs, but the chamber seemed to twist and shift, the path back becoming increasingly convoluted. The forest around him had transformed. The trees loomed larger, and the path he had followed was no longer visible. Desperate, Jake stumbled through the woods, the forest seemingly closing in on him. The oppressive silence was punctuated by occasional whispers, like echoes of the past. His flashlight flickered, and he could no longer tell which way was forward. As night fell, Jake found himself back at the abandoned cabin. Exhausted and disoriented, he collapsed on the floor. The whispering grew louder, and he saw the figure again, now appearing more menacing. "You cannot leave," the figure said. "The path is lost to you now." Jake realized with horror that he was trapped. The forest had changed the path, erasing any chance of escape. The pendant he had found seemed to glow faintly, and Jake understood that it was a key, a link to the forest's guardian. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed his grandfather. The pendant was now a symbol of his fate, a reminder that some paths were never meant to be uncovered. The guardian would keep the secrets of the forgotten path, ensuring that those who ventured too deep were forever lost in the silence of the Northwood Forest. Jake's disappearance became another chapter in the forest's dark lore. The cabin remained a silent witness to the secrets it held. The forest's silence endured, a barrier between the known and the unknowable, guarding its ancient mysteries from those who dared to seek them, a cacophony of lost voices. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, search parties found Evelyn's lantern on the altar, its flame long extinguished. The clearing was empty, and there was no sign of her. The forest had claimed another soul, just as it had her great-uncle. The lantern, now a silent witness to the ritual's dark legacy, remained among the other forgotten lanterns, its light extinguished, guarding the secrets of Blackwood Forest and the malevolent keeper that dwelled within. The Shadow's Embrace. On the outskirts of the small town of Ravenswood, a dense and ancient forest known simply as the Shadowwood stretched out like a living nightmare. It was a place of legend and dread, where the sun's rays barely penetrated the thick canopy and where eerie sounds seemed to come from every shadowed corner. Lydia had always been skeptical of the stories her grandmother told about the Shadowwood, but after her grandmother's passing, Lydia found a dusty journal among her belongings, filled with cryptic notes and a single map leading to a location marked as the heart of the forest. The journal spoke of a malevolent presence known as the Shadow, which had the power to ensnare lost souls. Determined to unravel the mystery, Lydia set out to explore the forest. Armed with the journal, a flashlight, and a sense of resolute curiosity, she ventured into the depths of Shadowwood. The air was thick and heavy, the silence almost suffocating as she followed the path outlined on the map. Hours passed as Lydia wove her way through the maze of trees and undergrowth. The forest seemed to shift around her, with familiar landmarks disappearing and reappearing in strange configurations. She occasionally thought she saw fleeting shadows moving at the edge of her vision, but dismissed them as tricks of the light. As dusk fell, Lydia reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling stone altar covered in strange runes and symbols. The clearing was unnervingly quiet, and the air felt charged with an oppressive energy. Lydia approached the altar, her flashlight casting long, wavering shadows across the ground. The journal had mentioned a ritual, one that could reveal the truth about the shadow and how to confront it. Lydia carefully set up her flashlight and began to read from the journal's pages, reciting the incantations written in an ancient script. The forest seemed to hold its breath as she spoke. As Lydia finished the ritual, the ground trembled slightly, and a cold wind swept through the clearing. The temperature dropped, and the shadows around the clearing began to stretch and shift unnaturally. The symbols on the altar glowed faintly, and a dark mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around Lydia. In the midst of the mist, a figure began to materialize. It was tall and indistinct, cloaked in darkness. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with a malevolent light. Lydia felt a chill run down her spine as the figure approached, its presence radiating an almost palpable sense of dread. "Why have you disturbed my domain?" The shadow's voice was like the rustling of dead leaves, its tone cold and resonant. "I seek the truth. Lydia replied, trying to steady her voice. "I want to know about the shadow and why my grandmother feared it." The shadow seemed to consider her question for a moment before speaking. "You have awakened that which should remain undisturbed. The forest has its own will, and it does not take kindly to intruders." As the shadow spoke, Lydia noticed something strange. The mist around her began to take on shapes, forming images of people, her grandmother among them. The figures were distorted, their faces etched with terror. They seemed to be reaching out toward Lydia, their eyes pleading for help. The shadow continued, its voice now tinged with a strange, almost mournful tone. "I am bound to this forest, feeding off the fears of those who come seeking answers. Your grandmother understood the truth too late. She became one of us, trapped in the forest's grasp." Lydia felt a surge of fear and anger. "What do you want from me?" The shadow's form seemed to grow darker and more menacing. "You are now part of the forest. To leave, you must join the others, surrendering yourself to the shadow's embrace." Lydia's heart raced as she realized the gravity of her situation. The forest seemed to close in around her, the mist thickening and the shadows elongating. The figures of the people she had seen began to move, their ghostly forms converging on her. Desperate to escape, Lydia grabbed the journal and the flashlight, fleeing the clearing. The forest had become a maze of shifting paths and dark, foreboding shapes. Every direction seemed to lead her back to the clearing, the mist swirling more intensely with each step. She ran until she could no longer tell if it was day or night. The mist seemed to suffocate her, and the whispers of the trapped souls grew louder, their voices melding into a haunting symphony of despair. The shadow's laughter echoed through the forest, a chilling reminder of its omnipresence. Eventually, Lydia stumbled and fell, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and extinguishing with a soft thud. The forest was now enveloped in complete darkness, and the figures of the trapped souls closed in around her. She could feel their cold hands reaching out, pulling her into their eternal torment. As Lydia was engulfed by the mist, she felt a strange sensation, a cold, shadowy embrace that seemed to consume her very essence. The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was the shadow's face, its eyes glowing with a cruel satisfaction. When dawn finally broke, search parties found Lydia's flashlight and the journal near the edge of the forest. There was no sign of her, only the oppressive silence of Shadowwood and the lingering mist that seemed to guard its dark secrets. The forest had claimed another soul, and the shadow remained, its hunger unsated, waiting for the next curious wanderer to awaken its malevolent presence. Visitor. In the remote village of Eldergrove, nestled at the edge of a vast and ancient forest known as the Valewood, a chilling legend had persisted for generations. The locals spoke in hushed tones about a secluded cabin deep within the forest, where those who ventured too close would never return. The cabin was said to be cursed, its last visitor forever lost to the shadows. Sophia, a young historian with a fascination for local folklore, was drawn to the legend of the cursed cabin. She had recently come across old journal entries and sketches in the village archives that hinted at the cabin's location. Eager to uncover the truth and perhaps disprove the superstitions, Sophia set out to find the cabin. The sun was setting as Sophia began her hike into the Valewood. The forest was dense and foreboding, with twisted trees and a thick undergrowth that seemed to swallow the light. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The forest felt alive, and every sound seemed to echo unnaturally. Sophia followed the directions from the old journal, navigating by the landmarks described within. The path was challenging, and the forest grew darker as night approached. Despite her growing unease, Sophia pressed on, driven by her determination. Eventually, she stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood the cabin, exactly as described in the journal. It was weathered and decrepit, with a sagging roof and broken windows. The air around the cabin felt colder, and the forest felt eerily silent. Sophia approached the cabin cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing an interior covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The furniture was old and mismatched, and there was a cold, musty smell in the air. On a table in the center of the room lay an old diary, its cover worn and faded. Sophia picked it up, her heart racing with anticipation. The diary was filled with entries describing the experiences of the cabin's last visitor, a man named Thomas, who had disappeared without a trace. Thomas's entries became increasingly frantic. He wrote about strange noises in the forest, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The last entry was particularly disturbing. The shadows are closing in. I hear them every night now, their voices growing louder. They want something from me. I can't escape the darkness. I fear I will become one with it. As Sophia read the entry, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the cabin. The temperature dropped and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. Her flashlight flickered and the whispers from the forest began to seep through the walls. Sophia tried to shake off her growing sense of dread and decided to investigate the rest of the cabin. She found a small room in the back with a locked chest. With some effort, she managed to pry it open, revealing an assortment of old letters, photographs, and a collection of strange artifacts. Among the artifacts was a peculiar, intricately carved wooden box. When Sophia opened it, she found a locket with a faded photograph of a woman and a child. The photograph was old and the faces were barely visible, but something about it seemed hauntingly familiar. As she examined the locket, the whispers grew louder, filling the cabin with a disorienting din. The shadows in the room seemed to move of their own accord, coalescing into dark shapes that swirled around her. The whispers began to form coherent words, though they were distorted and echoing. Sophia felt a sudden, intense cold and saw her breath misting in the air. The shadows converged on her, their shapes becoming more distinct and threatening. The whispers turned into a chorus of mournful voices, each one crying out in despair. In a panic, Sophia grabbed the diary and tried to leave the cabin, but the door wouldn't budge. The shadows had enveloped the entire cabin, and the whispers were now a cacophony of anguished cries. The darkness pressed in on her, and she could feel the oppressive weight of the forest's malevolent presence. Desperate to escape, Sophia found a small window and managed to squeeze through. She stumbled out into the clearing, but the forest had changed. The path she had taken was gone, replaced by a maze of shifting shadows and tangled undergrowth. The whispers followed her, their voices echoing through the trees. As she stumbled through the forest, the shadows seemed to chase her, their shapes flickering in and out of view. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Sophia felt as if she were being pulled into the darkness. Eventually, Sophia found herself back at the clearing, but the cabin was gone. In its place was an empty, fog-filled void. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. Sophia felt an overwhelming sense of dread as she realized that she was utterly lost. In the early hours of the morning, the search party found Sophia's flashlight and the diary near the edge of the forest. There was no sign of her, and the cabin had vanished without a trace. The villagers whispered about the forest's latest victim, adding her name to the list of those who had become one with the shadows. The Valewood remained as mysterious and foreboding as ever. The legend of the cursed cabin lived on, a reminder of the darkness that lurked within the forest and the price of seeking out its hidden truths. Sophia's fate became a chilling addition to the tale, a cautionary story of how the shadows of the forest claimed yet another soul.